Us. I'm very encouraged by the turnout, and I think it says something about the need for this kind of discussion. Special thanks go to our distinguished guests, Dr. Carey, Professor of New Testament, Dr. McDonald from the LTS Writing Center. He's a writing coach. Dr. Williams, Assistant Professor of Worship and Preaching. Thank you so much for joining us. I guess it's a truism that we love our professors and enjoy our classes tremendously here at LTS. Presentations by professors are high caliber and class discussions very, very lively. And then we go to our respective desks and sit down to tackle our written assignments. We have the information in our heads and in the extensive notes that most of us maintain. But the challenge begins right then and there. How to turn all that information into a well-written work product, and especially in the way that our professors want to receive it. I've never had the opportunity to work with Dr. McDonald, but I have received help from his colleague, Mr. Frank Gray, a number of times. And I have individually sought help from Drs. Carey and Williams. And both of them, I must say, gently but sternly, have had to steer me in a direction that I never thought to aim for from the get-go. And I suspect that is the case with most students. So here we are with our experts and hoping to learn from them the many different types of theological writings and ask them questions that we may have. Dr. Carey, Dr. McDonald, and Dr. Williams, again, thank you so much for joining us. I'll start with Dr. Carey. Since you agreed to focus on interpretive essays, let me ask you this: what are they, and what would you like us to do on those assignments?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you to Hyiwot and to the SCC for the invitation. I'm entering in chat the best resource I found for theological writing along these lines. Nothing's perfect. Nothing fits every context. This one by Michael Kibbe from Topic to Thesis does describe the process as well as anything I've seen, though it's primarily designed for an evangelical context where some things are different, but I wanted to share that. So to answer your question directly, Hyiwot, there are academic disciplines, especially but not only biblical studies, theology, and history, that will ask you to write an interpretive essay where you are expected to provide a focused interpretation of something, usually a written text, but it might be a work of art or a performance or any kind of other thing. And the thing that I want to say first and again is that when you're working on an interpretive essay, the key to writing a strong one happens before you start writing. The most important thing happens before you start writing. So I'm going to talk about 4 parts of the process as I understand it, and then offer some general comments. But an interpretive essay is you saying what you think, something you think about a text or other object of interpretation. So the 4 items I'd like to talk about are the study you're going to do, the thesis you'll develop, the evidence you'll use, and the possibility that you might rebut other points of view in your writing. I'll be as brief as I know how to be. So study is the most important part, the part you do before writing. If you're interpreting a text, read it carefully before you get started. Take notes about the language, the cultural context, the larger flow of the text. If you've been assigned a topic, read it with that topic in mind. And read other relevant things that will give you additional information about the text you're interpreting. Maybe you'll be interested in the biography of the author, or the social context in which they're working, or the history of an idea, or something that will inform your writing. But what you're looking for in all this reading is evidence. So you're taking notes, you're gathering resources, you haven't decided what you think yet, but you're thinking about it and you're gathering stuff. And at some point, you're going to sit back and think, what do I want to say about this? What do I care about? What do I want to tell someone else? And when you do that, when you've identified that thing you want to say, that's your thesis. That's the point you're going to make throughout the whole paper. And you have gone a long way at that point. I thought about what kind of thesis might be helpful, what kind of assignment. And I thought maybe you're going to write a paper. I made up this guy, Hugh of St. Clavicle, a medieval monk. And you're going to analyze his appeals to the topic of heaven in sermons. Hugh of St. Clavicle. And let's think about possible things you might say about Hugh and heaven. One might be that Hugh used heaven to motivate his parishioners, his audiences, to perform acts of charity. He used heaven to encourage people, to motivate people. Or you might argue that Hugh never preached about heaven before he went into great detail about hell. And that's your observation. Or you might argue that Hugh didn't rely on the Bible to talk about heaven nearly as much as he did his own mushroom-induced visionary experiences. Right? Those are three different theses that you could argue. And when you've identified the thing you care about enough to argue about, once you've done that, all that evidence you've gathered begins to sort itself out. Now, when we think about those three options, heaven as an encouragement, heaven or hell, or heaven and mushrooms, notice that each of those three ideas is specific, right? Someone could see it a different way. And so in an interpretive essay, you want to say something specific and definitive that you need to make a case for. This is really important. Somebody else might argue something different or even just disagree with you. And now it's your time to flip the screen and imagine that you're one of us reading your paper. Because what we're looking for is for you to have that thesis, that definitive idea, and then give convincing evidence to support it. That's almost all we're looking for, is that you've thought it through and you can make the case. Pretty much everything else doesn't count. So I want to talk about the evidence for a minute. I'll be almost done when I do. But once you've gathered all that evidence, you're going to start sorting it out. And I literally, no matter what the size of the writing project, just use a blank piece of paper. And I start putting down all in different parts of the page, different ideas, different things I've gathered. And I look at it. And to me, it's like if I had a whiteboard and I could just erase and write and mark and draw lines and squiggles. And I wait to see, are things starting to fit with each other close to this thesis? Some of the things I write down won't make it into the paper. They don't belong. Others, it'll be clear how they fit together. But your evidence is what the strength of your paper really depends on. So the more of it, the more direct it is, the more relevant it is, the better your paper. And the best kind of evidence comes out of Hugh's sermons. I'm sorry for the roofing noise. I'm sure you hear it. The best kind of evidence comes out of that primary source. Or there could be other primary sources. Maybe other people wrote reports of what they thought about Hugh. Or maybe There are other texts from the same period that talk about heaven, and those are primary sources too, but those are your best. The direct text or artifacts that you're interacting with, detailed examples, patterns, literary structure. And there are helpful secondary resources. Maybe you read a biography of Hugh's life, or maybe the course is on heaven and you've read a book on the history of heaven as an idea and you can plug Hugh into it. Those secondary sources and the opinions of other scholars and interpreters matter too, but none of them are as good as getting into that primary source you're dealing with. And maybe you're going to think about it and realize other people have other opinions that you've read or imagined. Like maybe somebody said all Hugh cared about was fire and brimstone, and that was all he preached. But you want to say Hugh was all about encouragement. That's rebuttal. So we have a thesis, evidence, and rebuttal. And that's really the structure of your paper. When you've identified your thesis and figured out how the evidence lays together, before you've even opened Word or Google Documents, you've done most of the work. And the writing should follow fairly painlessly after that. Just a couple of other comments, won't take long. Generally speaking, state your thesis as quickly and directly as you can, even if it's the first sentence of the paper. You do not want Catherine Williams being confused. You want her happy. You want her knowing where you're headed. Write as directly and clearly as you can. Don't fancy it up. Nobody cares. All we're trying to do is understand what your ideas are. So there's no reason to be cute or fancy. Use every paragraph, each one, as a step along the way, one piece of evidence or one part of your argument, step by step, paragraph by paragraph. And then I want to say, almost finally, that your essay isn't about how great Hugh was or why it's relevant today or why you love Hugh so much. Catherine cares about that, and you can say it in a few sentences or so. But the strength of your essay is in making the case for that thesis you chose. And that's what we're really looking to understand. So in conclusion, the most important work you do happens before you start writing, as you gather your material and begin to organize it. And if you're lucky enough to have a professor who puts sample essays on their website, you should look at them. So thank you, Hyiwot. I hope I'm under time. I think I am.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. All right. Dr. Williams, then I'll come to you. So you are the professor of worship and preaching. How does one start to write a sermon? And how do we build the written product into an inspiring collection of words?
Now, that's not fair. You didn't give me that question before tonight.
You didn't follow the rubric.
I'm just going to free flow because there is no one way to write a sermon. A sermon, it depends on the form that the preacher decides to use. And there are, if you've taken my class, there are several different forms you can choose from. You can choose to go the narrative way. You can choose to do a dialectical approach. You can choose that 4-page organizational chart, trouble in the text, trouble in the world, resolution in the text, resolution in the world. I mean, you can organize it any way you choose, and it depends on the audience. Some audiences like it to sound a little more logical and linear, and they get it. They don't have any patience with you looping and doing circular thinking. Others, they need to hear stories. And you need to work your content into those stories, those narratives. So there really is no one way to write a sermon. And you may see books on how to write a sermon, and you may go on the internet and ask the question or ask Siri or I don't know what Amazon's lady's name is. And they may give you answers, but those answers are very contextual. Just know that. Having said that, what the framework that Dr. Carey just laid out, pretty much you can fit a sermon into it. And I'll tell you how that works, and then I'll say some things about writing sermons. The whole idea of study is what preachers do before you even start to write or speak a word. We call it exegesis for preaching. And so it involves a lot of sources where you get your facts, like encyclopedia and dictionaries, sources where you get critical commentaries. You consult a whole lot of sources and do your study, gather your information. And then what he called the thesis is what I call in my preaching classes the focus. That comes from Tom Long's book called The Witness of Preaching. The focus statement is something that when you finish preaching the sermon and somebody asks the listener, maybe your 12-year-old or your 5-year-old, what did the preacher preach? They should be able to say what was in your focus statement. It should be that clear. As a matter of fact, when I'm preaching, I put that focus on an index card and keep it in front of me, because chances are, if I start getting foggy and I look at that index card, I started to veer off somewhere else down a rabbit hole. So it is important to have that focus for the sermon. And then there's always the so what question that is answered in the body of the sermon. Before you conclude that sermon, you have to figure out why this matters. Why do people need to sit there and listen to me talk about this? And it has to go beyond the fact that it interests me. There has to be some human context within the sermon. So, having said that, the difference between writing a sermon, the major difference I would say between writing a sermon and writing an academic paper is that in a sermon, you are writing for the ear. An academic paper, you are writing for the eye. Both portals go to the brain, but they're different channels. It's not that you're writing unintelligent matter. It is intelligent matter. It needs to have organization and form, but it is getting in there through a different portal. So writing for the ear means a couple of things. One, short sentences work better. The lovely elocution that you can get away with in a research paper will put somebody to sleep in a sermon. So that you have to practice, and that is a real discipline. Take it from me. It's a real discipline to write in short sentences. But if you remember that you're writing for the air and people can't go back and read what you just said, then it helps to know what it is you're doing. And you are writing in paragraphs, one thought at a time, but the other key to writing sermons is transitions matter. When you're moving from one thought to the next, it can't be a leap. It has to be something where you take steps, literal steps, literary steps, that the listener can follow you as you get from thought A to thought B. and they're not left wondering where did that come from, or how did he get there? So transitions matter in sermons, and when I look at your paragraphs, I look at how you get from paragraph A to paragraph B. Pacing also matters, and by that I don't mean how quickly or slowly you speak. I mean how you pace your thoughts, how they appear. So when you're developing your thoughts throughout the sermon, if something is really compelling, you can't just do it in a minute and keep going. You have to be able to stay there, make sure it's really well developed before you take your journey to the next one. So pacing is also, because again, remember, it's going in to the brain through the ear. The other thing about writing for sermons that's different from writing for Dr. Carey's interpretive essay is that you are allowed to be personal. Judiciously, of course. This is not a tell-all or a bear-all event. But personal references are allowed, and that's because the preacher is a witness. And if the preacher is preaching good news and it doesn't feel or sound like good news to the preacher, then it won't be convincing to the hearer. So personal references and personal perspectives are allowed. Also, imagery. You can get away with poetic writing in writing sermons. Ask Sarah Ramsland. She'll tell you, you can talk about all kinds of images and metaphors. As a matter of fact, sometimes those bring the point home depending on the audience. So whereas creative writing is not a part of what you do for a research paper or an interpretive essay, in a sermon, because the aim of the sermon, based on St. Augustine's dictum to his proteges, is to teach, delight, and persuade, is what he said his sermons ought to do. Teach people, but teach them in a way that delights them, and also teach persuasively. And so the part about the delighting is where the emotions and the imagery and metaphor and creative use and imaginative use of language is allowed. And basically that's all I have to say until you ask me questions. I do much better when you ask questions. And so
We'll do that.
The end.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Williams. Yeah, we'll come back to you. Dr. McDonald, it seems to me that we come to you or to your colleague only when we're in trouble. So when it comes to research papers, how do we start that project? And what should we avoid at the beginning?
Well, Hyiwot, thank you for having me. Thank you, Dr. Carey, Dr. Williams, for what they have already said. One thing that I want to go back to and sort of reiterate what Dr. Carey said is that in my belief, and I guess I should tell you a little bit about me. I have a PhD in English from Penn State, and I am not a biblical scholar. I am not a theologian. I am not a seminarian. I'm an Episcopalian, if that matters. And a lot of my work was done in Southern studies and the works of William Faulkner. So that's why I made that had that little Faulkner joke for Dr. Carey. So I come to the table with a different skill set. I come to the table with knowledge of what it takes to write a clear, concise, critical essay. And Hyiwot, I'm going to sort of deviate from your question there. Sure. to sort of just reiterate kind of what Dr. Carey was saying about approaching writing. And my philosophy is you think, you read, and you write. But that thinking part is absolutely critical to the other two pieces. And I tell students when I meet with them that it's really important when we have a conversation about brainstorming, which is what Dr. Carey used as an example when he held up the white piece of paper and just jotting ideas down, that brainstorming is critical. And I tell students all the time, it's not elementary to do that. It's absolutely okay to write down everything that's on your mind, whether it's a free write, whether it's just jotting down words. You take that and then you mold that into where you think and feel your writing might go. Almost echoing kind of what Dr. Williams was saying about how you put together a sermon, the feeling, where is it going? And then you get into the reading stage and ultimately the writing stage. And sometimes, even for me, the writing stage is really hard if I haven't been really good at the first two stages. If I haven't really gotten a grasp on my context, the research material, the critical commentary, then I struggle with the writing. I really, really struggle. I'm writing an article right now that I'm using two texts. I'm pulling from two different pieces by the same author, and I'm really struggling with certain pieces and how I want to say it. But if I don't put that on paper first, I can't grapple with it. So the brainstorming, and that's one thing that I have in my notes that I wanted to mention, is brainstorming is critical. And also the importance of taking notes. The importance of allowing yourselves to look at pieces, look at critical commentary, and note taking is so essential. You don't have to highlight every page of every article. You don't have to do that. And one of the best things that I learned, and I tell students, go and look at the works cited of that article, because there are other resources from authors that commented within the topic of your article that you're reading. So use that. Also too, I want to comment on what Dr. Williams said about writing short sentences. John Steinbeck got away with writing short sentences in American literature. If you've ever read the novel of Mice and Men, great novel, but it's short sentences and it gets to the point. I want to reiterate that with what Dr. Williams says, but also on the flip side of that with Dr. Carey. If your short, simple sentences are not succinct and directly connected to a thesis, then it's really hard for your reader to make sense of that. It's really hard for that evidence to connect to that thesis. And I say to students also, if your evidence is not directly correlated to your thesis sentence, then we don't need it. Dr. Carey and Dr. Williams are reading enough papers as it is. They need to read papers that are succinct and to the point and are evidence-based. So a plug for the Writing Center. I'm an email away. If you work with Frank, Frank's an email away. The first thing that I will say to students, have you consulted with your professor? Where are you in that journey? Because again, that's not my skill set. I will help you navigate the prompt. I will help you move towards completion of the project. But offering content information is not my lane. Unless you're writing a paper on Southern Studies and William Faulkner, I got you. Otherwise, that's left up to the folks at LTS. So we're an email away. We can help you. I talk to students throughout the entire week, sometimes via text message, but we're here to help you. And I'm just gonna go back to what Dr. Carey said in the beginning. His introduction to this call was perfect and right on point of how you look at interpretive writing and how you go through the phases of that. So Hyiwot, I'm done.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay, I'll go ahead and open it up to our audience. Anyone?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
I'm Elizabeth Norman.
Hi, Ms.
And
Norman.
I enjoy writing, but it's personal for me. I have to learn how to be able, because once I write something, it's done and it's out the way. But when they comment on it, I'm kind of say, well, I'm finished. I don't want to answer that. So I have to be able to interact with my writing and not, because once I'm finished, that thought is gone. I'm to something else. So it's trying to be able to answer when somebody questions what I wrote. and be able to give them an answer because I'm to the next topic. That was it.
Okay, Dr. Carey?
Well, Elizabeth, if I heard you correctly, you and I have a lot in common. That we write something down and we think we explained it because we've said it. But we have to flip it around and imagine that someone doesn't know what we're thinking and needs us to talk it through to them a little more and explain why the thing we said fits the point we're trying to make. One way, not that I do it all the time, but one way that I deal with that if I'm writing a short piece is I read it out loud before I'm done. And it causes me to hear it. As Catherine said, your ears do work differently than your eyes do. It causes me to hear it differently if I read it out loud. I'll think, oh, that was quick.
I will
Thank you,
also
Dr.
say
Carey.
that's a really good editing strategy, is hearing you read your work out loud is powerful. And enunciate every word and really make sure that is, as what Dr. Carey said, will someone else get this? Does someone else understand what I get it? Will someone else get it? Yes.
Because I have read some of my material back to me, and then I start making changes. I don't want to fiddle in that area for a long time, so I want to write it and be finished. Because if I go back and read it, sometimes I want to change this and change that. So I need to find a way to be sound and done.
Elizabeth, that is, when it comes to academic writing, we talk about drafts. So the first time you write a piece or an essay or a response to a prompt is really the first draft. It is not the finished product. And if you think of what you are working on as a draft, then it might give you, I don't know, it might give you a different perspective on having to revise it, because our best work, all of us who are writers know that our best work comes after doing it over and over and over and over. And sometimes when we think we're done and we send it to the publisher or the journal editor or whoever it is, or even to the writing coach, and they say, well, look at this sentence or look at that thought, it's going to need work again. And I know the angst of having to revisit what you've done, but that is a mindset that will serve you well in seminary writing, thinking of everything as a draft, nothing final until the grade is on it.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Anybody else? Ken?
I have a question for Dr. Carey. It goes back in your interpretive writing. The fourth step, you said in a paper, rebutting arguments, I think is the word that you use. Could you expand on that a little bit and how that would fit in with the paper as a whole?
Sure. So when you choose a thesis, it's interesting to you, but it's probably not obvious to everyone else. And if you're working on something that a lot of other people have talked about, like a biblical passage, chances are someone in the world has disagreed with what you're about to say. And if you do much reading, you'll find one of those people. So in your writing, you want to address that. That's what a rebuttal is. You're addressing an alternative point of view or a potential criticism of what you've written. And, the rebuttal depends on what it is you're trying to rebut, but, it can be as simple as there are people who see it this way. Turns out Brian McDonald does on page 84. And here's a summary of his argument, but the reason I don't see it that way is this and this. That's a rebuttal. And depending on the size of your essay and the problems, that can be from 1 to 2 sentences to most of your essay. I mean, your essay could be, I'm taking on this controversial subject, and I'm going to show why my point of view is more persuasive than another. And almost the whole essay is written in the awareness of what that other point of view is. So there's no one size fits all, but if you're arguing something that's really worthwhile, chances are, you know, there are other ways to think about it that you need to address. And I'll just say, when I'm reading a paper and a student recognizes that and addresses that, that's when you're moving into A territory, right? It means they have a fairly thorough grasp of what it is they're trying to talk about, enough to know that their way isn't the only way.
I might add that in my rubric for preparing sermons, one of the questions I ask is, for whom is this good news? And the other question is, for whom might this not be good news? And the student has to seriously think about that, so that if they're talking about Jesus healing a blind person, it may not be good news for the blind community, because they don't see themselves as having a problem. They have learned to live with their blindness, and they're very fine. Thank you very much. So it's always good to consider someone who might disagree with your perspective, even in preaching.
All right, anyone? Sarah?
I'm curious how, I know this is a hard question perhaps to answer, but just in general parameter of how much time, Dr. Williams and Dr. Carey, how much time you spend preparing for a sermon? What does, what goes into that process for you, and how much time are you spending in that process?
If I spend 20 hours on a sermon, more than half of that is probably in study and reflection. Just journaling, note-taking, studying, before I even start writing, more than half of the time. And for a let's say for a 10-minute chapel sermon, I can spend easily maybe a good 15 hours, but it's not consecutively. It's probably over the period of about 2 weeks. So it doesn't feel like that much. But if I don't stretch it out for that length of time, it comes out half-baked.
Catherine, is that what you would do if you were preaching every week?
Probably not. I'd probably end up cutting and pasting from a sermon 5 years ago. I have never had, and I say this honestly, I've never had to preach every week. And so I don't know that I would spend 15 hours preparing a sermon every week. And because I'd be a pastor also, and it would not be reasonable. But I know pastors who have to preach every week who the front end of preparing is sometimes months away, so that they can give due process to the journey, the study.
So I'm no Catherine Williams, obviously, right? It probably takes me 6 or 8 hours, hoping to finish the sermon's writing by Friday, and it is never, I always wind up working it over on Saturday. But all the things I ask you to do in your interpretive essay, I do. I just do them faster than you do because I do it for a living. And And then, the conceptualizing, I also preach for the ear, not for the eye. And so my sermon manuscripts would impress no one. But there's a strategy to what I'm trying to do with that. And the other thing I would say is at least twice I talk it through out loud, at least twice, to see if it really, really holds. Again, that way. So 6 or 8 hours, I would guess.
Well, I have one question. Go ahead. Go ahead, please.
I did serve on a 4,000 member church staff where the worship was on TV every week and the pastor was the silver-haired devil in the gray suit. He spent 20 hours a sermon because that was his job.
Okay, Dr. McDonald, giving credit to authors and people that own the rights to their work. LTS is very, very serious about that. And I admit that I've been burned a couple of times. One of them was very, very funny. I cited something and the professor that shall remain nameless said, I don't see any evidence that this book was used in the paper. And that sort of cracked me up because there are some professors that say, when in doubt, cite. Are you from that school of thought?
I am. If you didn't know it previously, if that's something that didn't come into your mind previously, like when was the War of 1812? We all know it was 1812, right? But if you're writing about historic battles and X, Y, and Z in that particular context, and you didn't know that already, cite it. Just cite it. I know some of the, and I have been involved, Hyiwot, with some students who've gotten in a jam over some plagiarism stuff, and I can guarantee you 9 out of 10 times that I've dealt with those situations, it's just the student just didn't know, or the student just, hey, I didn't really know I had to do this, that, or the other. So I am very critical of that, And if I didn't know it before, I have to cite it. That's sort of my mantra. But a good question.
Thank you. Dr. Carey and Dr. Williams?
Same. And it could be a conversation you have with someone. I just put in chat, I was writing this afternoon. I'm on page 12 of the essay and footnote 43. So now that's an academic thing, but you're writing academic things.
And so people ask me that about sermons, whether when you quote someone, first of all, I say in sermons, quote judiciously. You don't just quote because it sounds good saying Shakespeare or Barth or Bonhoeffer or whoever. And you may not, depending on how the flow of the sermon is, you may just say, famous scholars have said, but in that manuscript, you need to have a footnote. You may not say the footnote in the sermon, but if someone needs to find out where that came from, you ought to be able to flip that manuscript open and say, it's on page so-and-so of this book written by so-and-so. Quoting and citing in sermons just sounds stilted. A lot of it just sounds stilted, and it gets in the way of the flow of the sermon, or the organic nature of it. But if you have taken work material from someone, their name should find its way in there somewhere. Or if you don't know who it is. Now, I know in certain preaching traditions that, having said all that I just said in the past few minutes, there are certain preaching traditions where words are considered public treasure, and whole formulas of words get passed on from generation to generation, or from preacher to preacher to apprentice to protege. And that's a whole different story we can get into when we're talking about cultural diversity in preaching. But if you're preaching with a manuscript, that citation needs to be in the footnote.
Thank you. Anybody else? Greg is getting antsy. There you go.
Dr. Williams can smile at this question as I throw it out to you, but with book reviews and then writing a book review, how do you not sound like you're just summarizing or just rehashing information by the author? Is there a thought to like grabbing hold of a strength or a weakness and kind of shaping an argument around that and letting everything else fall around that idea, like almost like Dr. Carey was saying with the thesis, that you drive at something and then you work off of that? That's my question. Thank you.
I'll put that to Dr. McDonald.
So Dr. Williams has passed to me, and I'm glad to answer that question, Greg. First of all, thank you for saying that you're a Penn Stater. I love to meet Penn State folk. I'm going to say to you that when you're writing a book review or doing any kind of work of that nature, that you're very conscious about, number one, the whole idea of how do you summarize versus how do you paraphrase. And it's critical to understand the summary, because a summary is you've read it, you've closed the book, you're writing just a snapshot. When you're paraphrasing or doing a précis, you're taking sort of some executive information out of that text, so it's someone else is going to be able to read it and pick it up. So it's a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope, but you know when you're writing that review. For example, since Dr. Williams mentioned Shakespeare, I'm going to use a Shakespeare reference. If you're writing a play review of Hamlet, and let's say we've all read Hamlet here, your book review is going to be very closely knitted with kind of what you would read as the No Fear Shakespeare version of where, hey, I can't read the play, but I'm going to do No Fear Shakespeare. But you're going to be very clear and very precise in your review of that play. You're going to talk about the static and dynamic characters in that play. You're going to talk about the elements of suicide in that play. So it's dicey, but in the end, you're owning your own words. Did that help you, Greg, or did I confuse you? No, okay, good. Okay, good.
In academic book reviews, we're often instructed to summarize the work, to demonstrate what your professor wants to know is, do you understand it? And then how do you respond to it? What is your critical assessment? So you do have to summarize it, and that might be most of what you write.
Okay, there's a question in the chat that says, I imagine that's Jen. Should we be using works cited in addition to our bibliography when we have learned something from a book but aren't quoting directly? Or does Chicago only ask for a bibliography? Dr. McDonald?
I am not a Chicago style expert. And I have said to students over and over, I've got too many styles already in my brain to learn another one. So I'm going to ask Dr. Carey, Dr. Williams, what you asked for on your papers. What does that look like? Because I am not as familiar with Chicago.
You know, I would say if you learned something but it didn't go in your paper, you don't need to cite it anywhere. If you learned something and it went in your paper, then it needs to be cited and show up in the works cited. But I typically, it's very rare in academic writing to have a works cited and a bibliography.
Yeah.
That's almost unheard of.
I agree with that.
And I generally don't ask for a works cited page, I ask for a bibliography.
You know, there is a part when one of the things that I said that it's important to me is put yourself in our place, trying to assess the work that you did. So I want to know, did you read the stuff? Right? Did you read it well enough to engage it in detail? And so if there's stuff in a works cited or a bibliography that I can't tell you read, there's a part of me that's thinking, huh? Because I'm really looking to give you credit for the information and the ideas you present. I mean, that takes a lot of effort on our part, but that's what we're doing. We're not sitting around thinking, is this person smart? We're trying to track your thoughts.
Well, I always try to imagine my professors reading my paper, and when it comes to Dr. Carey, I imagine him with one eyebrow arched up, and I go, oh, okay, maybe I should do this again.
No, but I have been known when a student does something that makes me laugh, I have been known to put the paper down, walk around the block before I come back to it.
Okay. I'm hoping none of us have been the cause for that kind of reaction.
It's been a long time.
I put the paper down and go brew a cup of tea.
Okay, I have one
Hear
last.
my first example?
Sure.
I mean, this is 25 years ago. A student was talking about this ancient Near Eastern text called the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the villagers send a prostitute to tame this mythical wild man. And this first-year college student writes, when Enkidu saw that the woman was naked, his vulnerability surfaced. And I could not grade that paper faithfully without taking a walk.
Okay, that sounds like a new phrase that I heard today. Instead of saying somebody died, you say he assumed room temperature.
Wow.
So, Dr. Carey, well, let me come back to you one more time. With your interpretative essays, you said, to use your example, with the Hugh, is it the Saint of the Clavicle?
Hugh of St. Clavicle.
Okay. So you said, if we had a choice of, say, him talking about heaven or hell or mushrooms, if we actually do a good piece of writing, does it matter which topic we pick?
It does.
It does, okay.
Because your evidence is going to depend on the track you choose. Right?
So would your expectations be, well, would you be disappointed if you're waiting to hear somebody write about what he had to say about heaven, but that person picked up on mushrooms and how he dealt with them?
Not if they're answering the heaven question and this is how they're doing it. I don't pick up the paper thinking this is what this student needs to say. Though when I see what their thesis is and the text they're working with, I do think there's certain turf that needs to be covered probably. But they do not need to write what I want them to write.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Williams, for the occasional preacher that is asked to do a sermon, to a new church or a new collection of people, do you always start with thinking about the audience? Is that your first research about the audience that you would be talking to?
For me, it is an important part of my approach. if I know the audience, either because I'm familiar with them or because of the cultural context, then I know that there's certain expectations. And there is a certain texture to the sermon, whether it's tightly woven or whether it's more relaxed. Knowing the audience informs me. And if I don't know them, I go in there and I give it my best shot, but I'm spending the first minute or two reading them, so that if I have any humor in there, I'll know whether to leave it out or leave it in, or take it out or leave it in. Certain illustrations, if I'm illustrating a point, who the audience is will determine whether that will go over well or whether it will fall flat. Since there's always a little wiggle room in my sermons anyway that I can improvise, the audience has is a big determinant of how I do that, and if and how I do that. Yeah. I've never felt
Okay.
comfortable. I've gone to preach to audiences that I didn't know at all, and I just never know how the sermon goes over, because it's an odd feeling.
Well, thank you. It's just about 8 o'clock. I'll give each one of you time for closing remarks. Dr. McDonald, any advice for us?
Well, just reach out if you need me. Reach out to me or to Frank if you need me. We're here to help you. We're here to make your journey as painless as possible. There are a lot of good people on staff here, a lot of very, very bright folks that are here to help you. So just if you need me, just reach out. Again, here to help, here to look at papers, here to help guide you in your writing. And I appreciate Dr. Williams and Dr. Carey for their participation here, because I always learn from them as well. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Williams?
I don't have any closing remarks, but I will echo what Dr. McDonald said. I would rather you reach out to me and bother me than struggle and fail.
Absolutely. I've talked more than enough and learned a lot from Professor Williams and Dr. McDonald. So thank you a lot.
Well, thank you very much, all of you. It's been a pleasure. Jen, do you want to announce what's coming up tomorrow?
Or I'd be happy to announce that. I have a 2-year-old who is vying for my attention. But first of all, thank you all for being here. Those of you who have been panelists, and Hyiwot for leading the discussion, and all of you who have attended. We're really glad that you're here. This has been the best turnout so far for Spirit Week. So yes, clearly this was a much needed event. And if there's something that we can do to help as the SCC going forward, please let us know. We want to be able to help in that capacity as well. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock, we have Dr. Williams and Dr. Baxter will be facilitating a conversation on the arts and Black history. That does require a registration, but you can still sign up for that. Just click on the links that we've sent out. And then tomorrow evening, I hope you'll join us for Battle of the Brains, which is to be a very fun, comical time with our professors and staff debating in favor of something they do not like. So we are excited to hear what they have to come up with. And then of course, Friday is the end of our Spirit Week, and we hope that you will join us for that as well. If there's no other questions, we will see you at another event.
Yep. Thank you, Jen, and thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.